we'll be just talking about standards for assessment and how to use those standards to give meaningful and useful feedback to learners and to their language managers. So the big question, why do we need standards, or why do we need a framework for assessment? And the reason is because a clear framework helps us give feedback that's really useful for participants and for their language managers to know where they're at and to plan for their future training. So that's really the goal. So what I've seen on some of the performance reports as they come in is that when people aren't sticking to the framework, there's two things that people tend to assess. And one is who we think they are, like how we feel about them or how we see them as people. So things like when we say this person is intelligent and ambitious, when we say they're broad-minded, that they're highly motivated, that they have leadership qualities, that they have a sense of humor. These are all things about who they are. But the quality of the person or how we perceive them to be doesn't really help them know where they are in terms of their language learning, in terms of their proficiency, and it also doesn't help them prepare for future trainings. The other thing that I see a lot on the performance assessments are when teachers talk about how learners make us feel. And we know that in this immersion experience, it's very intense, it's very emotional. And so we have a lot of feelings about the participants, but using a framework helps us move away from our feelings about them. And again, just really focus on assessing their proficiency. So some examples are saying that they're delightful, or that they're impressive or remarkable or unique. So those sorts of things, I put a bunch of words in here, intensifiers that I see a lot. We tend to gush about these students because we do become attached to them during the training period. But again, those are not very helpful when they're trying to decide how to proceed with their training. So things like outstanding, unique, best, remarkable, astounding, amazing, surprising, all of those sorts of things. I'll just ask you to keep those kinds of comments out of the performance reports. So the things that you will be asked to assess are two things. One is their attitude and engagement. So that's, and I'll go into that a little bit more. And then the other is their language proficiency. So the attitude and engagement, it has to do, it's this first section of the performance report. And it has to do with things like, did they arrive on time and prepared? Did they take advantage of the opportunities to use their language? Did they prepare their homework? Were they actively engaged? Those sorts of things are all in the first section. And actually this first section is the basis for their letter grade. So this is one of the questions that people asked. Okay, we have to give a letter grade to DLI students. Where is this letter grade supposed to come from? And we do have this kind of grading breakdown, which I've taken from the WLC 370 syllabus. You can see that some of it is content. So there's the final project, there's quizzes, and there's homework. Those are all kind of could be graded, like somebody gets an A, somebody gets a B, somebody gets a C. But most of it is really their attitude and engagement. So attendance means, did they show up for everything? I think in the residential programs, everyone gets 100% for those, unless they refuse to come to class, which I don't think happens very often. Participation has to do with, are they engaging? Are they answering questions? Are they active in the class? So that's 15% of the grade. And then conversation sessions, that's just your sort of one-on-one conversation time with students. Again, it really has more to do with whether they show up and they try. Activities, that's the cultural activities. I think it says 10%, but it should be 15%. So just, again, showing up and trying in the cultural activities. The OPIC, did they take the OPIC or not? They get 100% if they took the OPIC twice in the session. So again, proficiency is not part of how we grade them. We don't grade them on their proficiency. We grade them on how actively they were involved in the course. So the rest of the assessment is really about language proficiency. And what we use at Concordia is the ACTFL system. So the ACTFL has these different levels from novice to distinguished. And the important point here is you don't need to invent descriptors for the comments section of this performance report, because we use the actual proficiency scale. So I always encourage you to pull your descriptors that you put in the comments section from the actual proficiency scale. So I see a lot of things like they have a good comprehension or something like that. So they're descriptors that are just, it's not clear how they fit into this scale. And using this scale really does help the language managers and learners figure out, okay, what are the skills that I have now and where are the areas that I really need to work? And so for that reason, I encourage you all to familiarize yourself with the proficiency scales. And today, as I said, we'll be focusing on interpretive skills. So integrated performance assessments, this is something that Axel has created and that they sort of promote among language learners. It's a cluster assessment, which means that there's a bunch of different tasks that use the different skills, and they're within a theme or content area. So in the LTCs, you have students do, if you're doing Chernobyl disaster, you have them do a reading assignment, you have them do some listening, you have them do some conversation, sort of interpersonal work around it. You have them prepare a presentation about it. So you have them do a bunch of different kinds of tasks within that content area. And that's what's meant by integrated. So again, 3 modes of communication. Interpretive is reading and listening. Presentational, this is any time that they have a chance to polish and present something, practice it, make sure there aren't errors in it. And then interpersonal is this spontaneous communication. To me, I've put them in order from, I think what they start out with. The interpretive is sort of the easiest thing. Presentational is the next one, where they have an opportunity to put something together and present it. And then interpersonal, this sort of question and answer, discussion back and forth. Spontaneous communication is, to me, the most challenging thing that students have to do when they really have to come up with and understand language on the fly, or in these kind of informal situations, or just in a more spontaneous way. So the important point here is that it's not uncommon for learners to have different proficiencies in different modes of communication, depending on what they practice. So the students that we have, they've mostly focused on the interpretive skills, reading and listening. And so it's not uncommon for them to be advanced low in reading and listening, but then intermediate mid in interpersonal communication. That's not uncommon. So just bear in mind, that's why we have a different rating for each of these modes of communication. It's possible for them to have quite different abilities in the different modes. And once again, the ranges of performance, they range from novice low to distinguished. Most of our students are in the intermediate and advanced range. This little inverted pyramid, it shows sort of the amount of content that you need to master in order to be at a particular proficiency level. So you can see at the novice level, you don't need that much content to be able to sort of introduce yourself, exchange greetings, talk about your everyday. But once you get up into the advanced range, you really have to know about a broad range of topics and have a really broad vocabulary and command of a lot of different structures to be able to perform the skills that are associated with the advanced range. So that's what that little pyramid represents. Another thing you can see is that the colors kind of bleed into each other. That's because when you're in the advanced high range, you might, in some areas or some topics or some kinds of performances, you might be performing at the superior level. And in some areas, in some content areas, you might be performing below. So there is that kind of bleeding over into the different areas. It's not as cut and dry as, oh, if you're advanced mid, you can do all of these things. And they're not that precise. So another way that these assessments are integrated is with the domains of performance. So for each of those levels, there's lots of different areas where students might excel or need work. And I'm not going to go into these in a huge amount of detail. You can find a lot more information on the actual website, and I've put that information into the Google Classroom. And you can also contact me for that information. But basically, there are the functions, so things that they're able to do with the language. So tasks that they can perform. And then context has to do with situations where they can function. So you might have someone who does great at the dinner table with the family, but they would have a really hard time in a train station just because it's a very unfamiliar context. Another is content. So different topic areas. So we talk about familiar and unfamiliar topic areas. How many unfamiliar topic areas are there for this student? And then Text type is different kinds of sort of what they can understand and what they can produce to do these different kinds of functions. So for example, maybe I can read a menu, or maybe actually for our students, probably, okay, they can read a newspaper article on almost any topic just fine, but they might get really confused with a menu, right? Because they've never encountered a menu. But mostly we look at sort of reporting is a kind of simpler style of text, whereas something that's a persuasive article might be more complicated. Something that's in a dialect might be more complicated for some of our students, or something that's highly technical might also be more difficult for them to manage. So that's what text type is. And then the other domains are language control. So that's how, do they make a lot of grammatical errors, or do they sometimes misinterpret things because of grammar is oftentimes the issue, but sometimes it's not knowing the subtle differences between synonyms. Those sorts of things have to do with language control. And then vocabulary is just really has to do with the breadth of their vocabulary and how applicable it is to different situations. So how they're able to use and apply their vocabulary. So now I'm just going to spend the rest of the time talking about and discussing with you the interpretive mode. So the information that we get from students is their DLPT score, the Defense Language Proficiency Test, which is on the ILR. That's the Interagency Language Roundtable scale. So that's a numbered scale. It goes from 0 to actually goes up to 5. And it corresponds roughly with 0 range is the novice range for ACTFL, the 1 range is intermediate, and the 2 range is advanced. And then for our students, really, we usually they go into the superior range and not beyond that, which distinguishes, like, maybe they're a college professor in the target language, that sort of level. So the DLPT only tests interpretive skills. So they're only asked to do reading and listening tasks. So the students appreciate having DLPT style questions. And that's just because they feel like it's good practice for the test. And those questions are written in English. So they'll have a text that they either listen to or read in the target language. Then the questions are English. They're usually multiple choice. And they'll have some kind of distractors or some tricky things in the multiple choice questions. So there are a few reasons why those style of questions are not a great assessment of proficiency. One of them is that it tends to test students' testing skills rather than their actual proficiency. So some students, because they're very good at taking tests, they can do very well on the DLPT, even if their proficiency is not as strong as what it seems to be based on their test scores. And then other students can have a difficult time even if they have quite good comprehension, just again, because the way that the test is structured. So this will be true when you're assessing student proficiency. I would encourage you, I mean, it's great to give them DLPT practice, but for actually assessing their proficiency, I would encourage you to give them questions that are going to give you more information about how they're doing, about how well they're understanding the text. And that's what we're going to get to in a minute here. Another thing is that if students are tired, if they're doing this late at night and they've had a really long day, or if they're just not very motivated, they might also underperform. So we don't want to be measuring their proficiency based on a homework task that they've done when they were tired, right? I mean, we can certainly say, oh, the student didn't work very hard on their homework as part of their engagement, that first section of the performance report, but we want to be as precise as possible about their proficiency when we're talking about their interpretive skills. Another issue is that the questions might be poorly formulated. So for example, if you give students 4 choices, they might feel like 2 of them are correct, or they might differ in opinion with you about which one is the best answer, or they might even have a hard time just understanding the question. So you might be typing a question in English, they've understood the article just fine, but they can't understand your question very clearly. So these are all reasons that I would avoid using the DLPT style questions for assessment. So an important piece for the interpretive mode is text selection. So you might choose texts to give to students just because they give background information on the next day's topics. So I know that the students really appreciate all of the learning that they do about current events and Russian history and culture through those readings. So if you're just giving them background information, that's a great reason to select a particular text. You might also select a text just to give them an introduction to the vocabulary and context. So the next day you're going to be talking about environmental issues. So you find a great text that has lots and lots of the vocabulary that you're going to be using the next day. That's a great reason to select a text. And sometimes you find something that you personally find really interesting, relevant, something that gives them insights into contemporary issues. That's also a great reason to give them a text. If it's something that like everyone in Russia is talking about right now, that's a great reason to give students a particular text. But for assessment, I think it's important to choose something, to take a look at what their scores are, their DLPT scores, or what you have perceived as their interpretive abilities, and choose something that's going to challenge them and push them a little bit. So something that's a little bit out of reach for them. And you can see what some of the characteristics of those texts are by going to the actual educator resources. They have a page for Russian, and they have samples of different Russian texts, and they say this is a good one for advanced learners, this is a good one for superior level learners, this is a good one for intermediate learners, to assess their language proficiency. So take a look at those. And again, you want to give them something that's a little bit out of reach. If it's too simple, then I think that those IPAs are probably a little bit boring if the text is quite simple. So take that into consideration. So more challenging texts for advanced learners include things that have unfamiliar subject matter. So it might be just something that they're unlikely to have read about or heard about before. If it has precise and specialized vocabulary and expressions. So just words that are only used in particular contexts or that are highly technical, or just that are not used as often, just not as common of words. Also more complex grammatical structures that might be tricky or confusing. And then something that requires cultural knowledge. So that could be things that include colloquialisms, are interesting, but also things that are highly referential. So you already had to have been following this political discussion in order to catch all of the cultural references or understand the context for a text. Also just having a more complex argument. So it has a sort of a thesis and evidence and that kind of a more sort of academic kind of structure. That's also challenging. And then more abstract or academic topics will also be more challenging. So that's just when you're doing an assessment, choose something that's going to require them to reach a little bit. So the interpretive integrated performance assessment that that I've sent to you, so you've all done one. Hopefully you were able to access it and sort of try it out. It's a framework that you can use on all domains and functions for interpretation, regardless of the text. So you could use this for a beginner text, and you could use it for a superior level text as well. So some of the sort of can-do statements that go along with the interpretive mode at the higher level can be assessed through, I hope you saw this, through the IPA. So understanding specialized or precise vocabulary and structures. So pulling out those vocabulary and structures that you want to see if they can find them in the text. I know that in the assignment that I gave you, they were written in English. And you also had to find them in English. If you were doing this for students who are studying Russian, you would write them in English, and they would have to find that vocabulary item in Russian. So that's one thing that was a little awkward, doing English to English. Understanding the main ideas and supporting details in different kinds of text. So maybe that's something that they can do in simple, concrete texts, but they can't do in more abstract texts. So that's another thing that you can test through this IPA. And then also just making note of, can they do this sometimes? Can they do it with support from instructors? Or are they generally always able to do that? Another is, are they able to derive meaning from context? So again, that's one of the questions. Are they able to make inferences? And then are they able to use knowledge of cultural differences to interpret texts? So then that could, again, be reading or listening texts. And again, just thinking about, okay, is this a student who can sometimes do this? that can reliably do this, or do they need help from instructors or from other students to accomplish those tasks? So I've given you a little preface here at the beginning about just that reading is an interpretive skill, sort of a description of what a superior level text looks like. So you can make sure that you're choosing texts that are adequately challenging if you have superior level or advanced high students. And then again, the idea that you're going to read this through multiple times. Okay, so this is another advantage of this kind of this way of asking questions, is that it encourages the students to keep going back and keep digging more and more into the text. So as I mentioned, the first part of the IPA is the keyword recognition. So what you would do is you would pull from the article some of the main words that you wanted to see if the students could understand. And you put them in the IPA in English and have them find the Russian word. And one of the nice things about this is it also gives students a little bit of a start, because they know if I just read these words, I have a little bit of a sense about what this article is about, right? So it gives them a little bit of help. But it's also sort of the easiest part because they can look these things up. They can use their translation tools to look these up when they're working on their own. And then, one of the things that we always rate students on is, are they able to identify the main idea and the supporting details in different kinds of text? So based on this assessment, you might say, based on parts 2 and 3 of this assessment, you might say, Harry was able to find the main idea, identify the main idea and supporting details most of the time in abstract texts and always in more concrete text. For example, that would be a descriptor that would give us a really good sense of or you might say he can always find the main idea and supporting details in familiar texts on familiar topics, but requires some support when he's dealing with unfamiliar topics. So that would make him more in the intermediate range, right? Whatever article you're reading, you can ask any student to do this little task as part of their assignment. Just write out what you think the main idea of the article is. Write it out in English. That'll give you a really good starting point for, whether the student generally understood the article very generally. So that's sort of the starting point. And then it's likely that they'll be able to do these first 2 sections after their first reading. So if they just sit down and read it, they might have to hunt a little bit for some of those keywords, but they'll probably be able to do these first 2 sections. Then they'll get to the supporting detail section and they'll read about what they're supposed to be, specific things they're supposed to be looking for in the text. And then they'll probably have to go back and read the text all the way through again. This is really good work for them because each time they read it, more and more things are going to come into focus, right? And they might assume that they've understood everything in the text, but they might start to find things that they missed on their first reading as they're trying to identify which of these supporting details are actually in the text and which ones have you made up as a distractor. And then again, just writing in the quotes of where they found that particular thing. You can also have them just write the letter. If they're working on paper, you can have them write the letter next to where the detail is in the text. That works as well. So then the next section is organizational features. How is the text organized? So honestly, for me, if you wanted to take something out of this IPA, I would take out the organizational features question, but it is good to get them to start thinking more analytically about how different texts are structured. It'll also really help them in their own writing, but it helps them just think more analytically about how different arguments are being made and how they're constructed. So again, if you just tell them if any of these apply, select them. And where do they find the clues? So for chronological, it might be something like, and the next thing that happened was, so sort of, and the next important event that might be a clue to chronological. For pros and cons in English, it might be something like, well, on the one hand, X, Y, and Z, and yet people who see it another way, X, ABC. So just picking out those kinds of discursive clues that help them understand how people are organizing their arguments. The next section is guessing meaning from context, and this is really important because it is one of the actful descriptors for the different levels. Some students are very adept at figuring out, you know, sort of putting the pieces together and figuring out language that might be either figurative, like sped right past those red lights, that's figurative language. And then also a word like aberration, which is just a less commonly used word. So maybe I assume that the student is probably not going to know this word, but I'm going to say, okay, now you've read this article twice or maybe 3 times to answer these questions. Can you figure out what this word means? Just sort of by panning out and thinking about the text. So any comments for those of you who did this assignment about any of these pieces? Was some of it unclear what was required, or did some of the questions make you think more than others?
Yeah, I have a question on section 4. When I was working on these features to organize the text, yeah, so it was a bit challenging for me to draw the line between storytelling and description because I'd say that most of the times they can be interrelated. So maybe you could comment on that, like how to better distinguish between them.
No, I think that's a great point, Tatiana, and I think that's something you can discuss with the students. And it doesn't have to be, I mean, one thing that's so nice about this framework is it doesn't have to be a right or wrong answer, absolute, like you get the point or you
Mm,
don't get it. But it's as you're having that conversation and as they've put, you know, because you're asking them to give you, okay, give me a justification, explain to me why you've chosen this. I mean, any student that's going to talk about the overlap between storytelling and description, that's a student that's analyzing the text at a superior
yeah,
level, right? Because
right.
they're able to think about the way that arguments are constructed.
Hmm.
So I don't think it's necessarily even a question of there being a black and white sort of right or wrong answer, but it's exactly that kind of discussion about how texts are constructed, and being able to talk to them and raise their awareness of those kinds of
Mm,
issues. So yeah, absolutely. I think there was storytelling in this text. There was description. Yeah, there was problem and solution as well, a little bit of that, because he was talking about you know, how the suit was managed, and then what he thought should have been done. Um, so I think even cause and effect, there's an argument for that as well, right?
oh yeah.
There's a compare and contrast section where he's saying like normal journalists do this, these crazy journalists do that. So that's a compare and contrast. So I think there's a lot of arguments for these different elements. It doesn't just have to be one.
Yeah, and it has a lot of overlap too. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay,
absolutely.
thank you.
I mean, and you know, now that you said that, it's probably good to prepare students for that little bit of ambiguity, just because these are students that like black and white answers, right? Because it's a multiple choice. They're used to that kind of
Hmm.
multiple choice setup. And so just getting them to, yeah, just to think and maybe even disagree. Maybe once you have a conversation about this, students will disagree, and they'll leave with different opinions about what they think is the most important organizational feature of the text. And that's okay, just as long as they're doing that more analytical work. I should mention that this kind of analytical work is also really important when they get into the higher levels on the DLPT, because they'll ask them those kinds of questions about structure. And so just for them to be prepared to do that kind of thinking. And then inferences, this is another section, and we do, and that's another sort of intermediate, advanced, superior level skill, depending on the text and how often they're able to draw inferences. Um, but just, okay, now you've read this whole text. How are you gonna, you know, what can you draw from it? What kind of interpretation can you make? And so some of those might have to do with tone. So some words and phrases that capture how you would describe the author's tone. Again, this is something that's subjective. It's something that's you know, different people might describe it in different ways depending on which pieces of the article they focus on. And then also just this sort of more open question about who is the audience for this? You know, what's the author's goal, and providing some evidence. And then in terms of perspective, I think, again, the author's perspective piece is one that might be more interesting in some texts. Could have removed it from this particular text. Um, but I think comparing cultural perspectives is really essential. So Again, this is just how might this article have been different if it were written for a Russian audience, but just thinking about some kind of question, open-ended question that gives them an opportunity to think about how that might be different. And what about personal reactions to the text? I mean, one way that you might use this kind of question is if you'll get a little preview of what students thought of the text or what they think of the issue and things like that. And then that's something that you can bring then into your classroom discussion. So, the goal of this kind of assessment is that I can sort of go through it and say, this student is able to identify the main idea, supporting details in these kinds of texts. They might struggle more in these kinds of texts. They're always able to do it, or sometimes able to do it, or they're only able to do it with support. Then I can talk about, they're able to infer meaning from context. They're able to talk about structure, the structure of the text, if that's an important piece. They're able to identify cultural perspectives and derive meaning from that. And then for the personal reaction, that's sort of the lead into your opportunity to discuss with them and to integrate this with other skills. So if they have a certain personal reaction, you say, oh, wow, you had a very strong reaction to that story about Fox News. Would you like to do a presentation about why you think Fox News is not an aberration in American journalism? Would you like to make that argument and present that argument to the class? Or would you like to do a written essay that's a response to this essay if you have a strong reaction to the text? So then you'd be moving them from that interpretive mode into the presentational mode. And then also preparing them to have, now they've read it several times, they've had a chance to reflect on it, to think about it, to answer these questions, and maybe they're ready then to start having that conversation. They're much better prepared then for that discussion in class as well. Obviously, because of the time, we're not going to go into those presentational and interpersonal assessments, but I think doing this a couple times especially in the second week of the course, giving them just a more complex text to work with and having them go through and just sort of systematically do all of these tasks